Just how explosive the environment is that diplomats and politicians are currently operating in is demonstrated by President Trump's latest post on his Truth social network. He accused the Ukrainian authorities of being ungrateful for America's peace efforts and reproached Europe for continuing to buy Russian oil. But both our side and the Europeans continue to look for workable solutions to end the war. That's how Volodymyr Zelenskyy put it. Based on the reports from the Ukrainian team at the negotiations in Geneva, he stated that the US proposals could take into account a number of elements that are based on the Ukrainian perspective and are critically important for Ukraine's national interests. TSN's own correspondent in Europe, Natalia Fibrik, is closely following everything happening in the course of these negotiations. She is now live with us. Natalia, hello? The president of Ukraine has already shared his information about the first meetings and conversations between the delegations. Maybe you know something more at this point.
Yes, hello, Alla. Indeed, we are following very closely and all the information that can be obtained from Geneva in general. And so we know that the main negotiations between the American and Ukrainian delegations have concluded. And in fact, they lasted less than an hour. And after them, with encouraging statements, came out the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He called these negotiations very productive, and the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, also said that the talks with the esteemed American delegation were very productive and ended with good progress. And now there is movement toward a just and lasting peace. And Rubio in particular also said the following. Let's listen.
Today's meetings were by far the most productive, meaningful, and significant that we have had so far in the ongoing peace process. However, there is still some important work that remains to be done, and our dedicated teams will be returning later this evening with additional updated information and further details.
And later today, during the course of this evening, at least that's what the Ukrainian delegation announced, there is supposed to be another meeting, this time between the Americans, Ukraine, and the Europeans. And Andriy Yermak also wrote about this. In fact, that's essentially all the information that has come from Geneva at this moment, because the negotiations are truly taking place behind tightly closed doors. A photograph of the negotiations has made its way around the world's media. On one side of the table, we see President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. On the opposite side are the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, and the first deputy minister of foreign affairs of Ukraine, Serhiy Kyslytsya. And the meeting place in Geneva is the U.S. mission to the UN. And this actually, well, at least for us, is a familiar format. We remember well that negotiations between the Trump administration and Russia took place in this format in January 2022, and that was right before the full-scale invasion. And the journalists standing in front of the UN mission can literally only see the movement of cars and delegations. In other words, there is no communication with the press, no press conferences are scheduled there. However, indeed, certain details throughout the day were provided by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He stated that after the first negotiations, after the initial meetings in Geneva between the delegation groups, he wrote that the American proposals may also take into account elements important for Ukraine and that the work is still ongoing.
The Ukrainian and American teams, as well as the teams of our European partners, are in close contact, and I very much hope that there will be results. It is necessary to stop the bloodshed and ensure that the war will not be reignited. I am awaiting the outcomes of today's discussions. I expect that all participants will be constructive. We need a positive result for all of us.
And the composition of the Ukrainian group president or the Ukrainian delegation was approved by the president the day before. As I already mentioned, it is headed by the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, and the delegation also includes the secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, and the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kyrylo Budanov, although he was not seen in the photo from the start of the negotiations. Chief of the General Staff Andriy Hnatov, head of the Foreign Intelligence Service Ole Ivashchenko, and First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Serhiy Kyslytsya. And foreign policy advisors from Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and the European Union also arrived in Geneva. And in fact, these European delegations brought an alternative version of the document, that is, the revisions that Europe proposes to make to this initial plan. And this alternative European plan has already, in fact, leaked to certain media outlets. For example, the newspaper The Telegraph has published it. And so one of the main issues that the Europeans want to change is security guarantees for Ukraine. In other words, the Europeans want to prevent a situation where the war and invasion of Ukraine could, well, start again. It also concerns an immediate ceasefire and monitoring of the silence regime using drones and satellites. There must also be the return of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. The next principle is the refusal to give up any Ukrainian territories that are currently controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, the European capitals are actually united here in the view that the war can only be stopped along the current front line. Also, there should be no reduction of the Ukrainian armed forces. And it's interesting regarding NATO membership. It states that this depends on consensus within the alliance, and Ukraine must confirm that it remains a non-nuclear country. And it's also interesting that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was particularly irritated by how, in fact, Donald Trump, let's say, cozied up to the frozen Russian assets. Trump's previous plan stipulates that $100 billion should go toward rebuilding investments in Ukraine. Half of the profits are supposed to go to the United States, and the European Union is also expected to provide an additional $100 billion. To this, Merz essentially responded that this is a matter between the Europeans and Ukraine. In other words, these funds in principle should not concern the Americans. And on the sidelines of the G20 summit, Friedrich Merz also stated today that he does not, in fact, expect a quick end to this peace process.
I remain, not to say pessimistic, but for now, I am not convinced that the decision President Trump is hoping for will be reached in the coming days. Today is Sunday. President Trump's plan envisions a conclusion already by Thursday.
And in general, the G20 summit that took place in Johannesburg, it turned into a sort of special summit focused on Ukraine. Because at first, Chancellor Friedrich Merz, President Macron, and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer held talks in a small group format. Then Canada, Japan, and other partners joined them. After these consultations, Merz was the first to call. In fact, even before the consultations, Merz called Washington. Then UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer did the same. And the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, made a statement in which she essentially confirmed that those leaks about the European alternative plan in the European media are in fact accurate.
First, borders cannot be changed by force. Second, as a sovereign state, Ukraine cannot have restrictions placed on its armed forces. If these restrictions leave the country vulnerable to future attacks and thereby undermine the security of all of Europe. Third, the central role of the European Union in ensuring peace for Ukraine must be fully reflected. Ukraine must have the freedom and sovereign right to choose its own destiny.
So, as previously announced, we fully expect these negotiations to continue later today as planned. Also tomorrow, Turkish President Recep Erdogan has announced that he wants to call Vladimir Putin. It is also known that on Tuesday, the coalition of the Resolute wants to meet online. They want to gather in order to assess and discuss the results of the negotiations that will be achieved in Geneva. Hello?
Thank you, Nataloshka. Well, as they say in Kyiv, it's not the first time for Ukraine to enter a difficult and lengthy negotiation process and to defend its interests. We wish our negotiators good luck and resilience. TSN's own correspondent in Europe, Natalia Fibrik, was in touch with us. Thank you.